Okay, now we're on to Blood Meridian, chapter 17 through 20. I've broken these particular slides up a little bit, as you can see by the breakdown there. But we'll see how far we get with this one, and then we'll move along. So, without further ado, I will go over some plot elements and some notes that I have on this topic. Okay. So, when last we left the gang in the last little video, we had them negotiating with some natives for whiskey. Well, indeed, they do go into the garrison and they pick up the whiskey, and after some discussion, they get whiskey, but then they cheat them being the natives out of whiskey. And if you sort of follow this thread a little bit further, maybe you can imagine that the garrison that they did get the whiskey from is probably going to be subject to attack very soon, because once the Indians figure out that, quote-unquote Indians, figure out that they have been cheated, they will probably wind up being very mad at the garrison, which is where they think this particular group came from. So just a little side note there, in case you were interested in sort of where the cynicism can lead sometimes, thinking through the plot. Anyway, we don't see that, so I won't dwell too much on that. They eventually continue traveling, and then there's some discussions by firelight that get a little bit dense in terms of the philosophy. I'll go over that just a little bit, but I do think that most of this boils down to that idea of, at least from one perspective, you can see it in the view of the fatalism versus nihilism, right? You know, is there a purpose, but that purpose is sort of faded? Is there just a God out there that's doing things that are not, necessarily always pleasant for mankind, but there is a purpose of some sort, or whether this is just sort of senseless violence. Depending on where you're at in the reading, you may fall in one category or another. They eventually encounter a Yuma missionary encampment, where some diseased settlers tell them about a ferry crossing. This ferry crossing will be a pretty significant plot element very soon. But they find that the ferry crossing is manned by an ex-doctor from New York, which is interesting, considering that he used to be a doctor, which is not in the most civilized time. But he was, in other words, he was educated. Maybe shades of the ex-priest, perhaps. Anyway, the chapter ends with some foreshadowing of trouble on the horizon. Chapter 17, that is. So. Some notes on that. There's a notable moment where we get a little bit of Glanton's introspection, which we don't get a lot with these characters, right? These don't seem, other than the judge maybe, and possibly the kid a little bit, we don't really see a whole lot of introspection going on with the gang, right? Meaning, there's not sort of self-analysis. But the narrative seems to pause sort of in this moment by by the campfire. And he muses sort of on his leadership and his place in the world, even. And I'll just read this quote off. All about him men were sleeping, but much had changed. He was equal to what might follow, whether his history would run concomitant with men and nations, whether it would cease men's destinies or given, yet he usurped to contain within him all that he would ever be in the world, and all that the world would be to him. So in other words, he's sort of saying, this is kind of my role. I may not like it all the time, but looking around at my men, I do feel responsible for them, and my place in the world will be determined by my leadership of them. Okay, kind of pretty deep, right? Kind of a deep moment for somebody that we just sort of consider a little bit on edge most of the times. But he is a little bit of a thinker. We get some sense that he does have something going on in there, right? Other than, just nothing. So the ex-priest and the judge, they have some comments on the metaphysics of the universe. And this is also interesting because this comes not completely out of nowhere, because we were set up this way by the narration to expect maybe some of these moments. But the language does get a little bit dense here. And so one of the things that they talk about, the question, and I'll read this off, the question was put as to whether there were men on Mars or other planets, blah, blah, blah. For existence has its own order, and no man's mind can compass that mind itself being but a fact among others. I was reminded a little bit of the Cartesian notion, I think therefore I am, right? Whether there are, similar creatures in other areas of existence. is really just sort of, it really just boils down to sort of how we experience the world, right? And that's the only consciousness that we have, right? So the fact that we can think about these things provides evidence for the mind itself. Like I said, little bit deep there, but that's just maybe something to chew on. That might be a good moment where some of this philosophy pops up. So if you do get asked that later, maybe this is the moment where you can parse through some of that denser language. The judge in chapter 17, he shows up a magic trick. There's a demonstration where he's in the firelight, and he sort of shows a coin, and then it disappears, and then it comes back, or something. It's kind of a strange sort of magical trick that the judge happens to know. But I think coming on the back of some of these discussions, it's to him maybe a demonstration of the world as illusion. Again, that idea of the illusion. So 259, there's the judge on war, which I will post a video of in just a little bit as a follow-up. But the judge on war is kind of I won't say famous because, I don't know how famous this book is, overall, but it's a very, it's quoted a lot, I should say, when people quote something of the judge. It's a really good moment where the judge explains sort of his philosophy of the world and how war itself is this ultimate game because the stakes are life and death. I'll post a video and see if you guys want to follow up with that. Glanton explains what is moral law. He talks about moral law and how people that create laws, that there has to be sort of something about right and wrong, right? There's sort of this inkling feeling that the judge may be right on a lot of things, but Glanton is the guy that sort of stands up and says, well, what about right and wrong, essentially? And the judge's response is telling. It tells a lot about his what he perceives as his place in the world and sort of his power over the world. His response is that moral law is just used to subvert the powerful. It's sort of a trivial, and it's always subjected to absolute law. In other words, if you have an opinion and I have an opinion and we disagree and I kill you, there's only my opinion left, right? So who's to judge what's right and wrong? Because all that you're left with, ultimately, symbolically or literally, is me, right? So the sense of power over others, the judge expresses the absolute morality, right? Agree, disagree, that seems to be his ideas. But then the ex-priest comes in and, because the judge says, hey, how about you? You're an ex-priest, maybe you can step in and sort of give this, poor misguided soul some guidance. And so he says, what does God say? Meaning, you used to be a representative of God. What would he say? And the ex-priest says, he doesn't really say. And the judge says, well, if you're taking no stand, if God doesn't take a stand, then he's already making his decision. He's essentially saying, I'm right. So by his silence. Again, agree or disagree, that seems to be pretty consistent with how the judge feels about power and the relation of morality to that power. The judge eventually, he finds a giant bone here. There's evidence of an ancient fossilized world around. It's just sort of laying around. So that's maybe a callback in that way. Moving on to chapter 18, Civilization of the Idiot. This is sort of a big moment in this particular chapter where that quote-unquote idiot, the way they refer to him, mentally challenged, kind of deformed, I suppose. Person is drug along by the Glanton gang, if you recall. Once there's a group of women that see this idiot quote unquote and they want to baptize him because they think God will heal him, or bring him up. They burn the cage. They say, that cage, he's living in a cage. How dare you? So this is an expression of sort of morality, right? That narrative of religion coming in and sort of trying to take over and change the fortunes of, in this case, a particular person. But in a way, it's a challenge, right? It's a challenge of, conversion and, seeing the world in a new way and seeing if that can affect, the way people are, right? It's sort of a nature-nurture kind of thing. I guess you could call it that. if you're familiar with that idea, that there's two variations of how people can be affected, and how their experience of the world and how they are affected mostly by either the nature of how they're brought up, or whether they're just sort of born that way, right? Nature versus nurture. So anyway, these guys are definitely the nurture, right? They think that they can change him because the very nature of God exists, and so there's a spark of humanity in everybody. So if they just sort of change his appearance, baptize him, sort of transform him into this new thing, that he will follow along, essentially. So they burn his cage, they change his appearance, and he seems really odd and out of place in this sort of little wool suit that they put him in. They're trying to turn him into a civilized person, right? But then he winds up stripping off his clothes and going into the water, and he almost drowns, right? And the only person that saves him is the judge, who comes in with his big hand and just lifts him out of the water. So, one could make of that as you will. Once again, the judge seems to be the person in charge here. So the women, using that idea, the women who want to change the idiot, they seem to see what they want to see, right? They can save him with their religious narrative. In other words, they're opposing this religious narrative, and since they believe so much, they expect sort of the world to change around their narrative. But what they're really trying to change is sort of this primal nature of the idiot, right? This violence, right? You could extend it, I guess you could extend it out to violence. Violence itself is sort of primal, and it seems to be sort of the equalizing force, right? And so they are offering religion, much like other evidences throughout the book of how religion comes in, but it's sort of this corrupted, weak narrative. And violence always seems to win out in the end, and this amorality seems to always step in. The judge, however, seems to accept the idiot state, his being the idiot, right? When I say his state, I mean the idiot, right? Quote unquote. He just accepts him. He says, this is not one of God's mistakes. This is God, right? Look, he's part of this freak show that we're experiencing, right? So the scene where he saves the idiot mirror seems to mock sort of a baptism. I think that's intentional, because knowing Cormac McCarthy and his biblical references, that does play a role in terms of how this is built. Or some ritual not yet, and he actually literally says in the book, the narrator says, or some ritual not yet inaugurated into any canon. So it's like he actually uses he being the author, uses the term baptism and says that this is sort of like a ceremony or baptism that no one's ever seen before, and it's sort of a bizarre variation of the kinds of rituals that we've seen before. So anyway, it reveals the judge as sort of this figure that always kind of steps in and produces this counter narrative to whatever narratives try to introduce themselves. And in this case, it's religion. And if you recall, maybe make a connection to abandoned churches, any religious elements. Tubin, the ex-priest, right? He's sort of a representation of the corruption. The ceremony in that small town where they get shot up, if you recall. So these are just sort of some connections that I'm making in my mind that I think are maybe helpful to call back to. So find instances of religion and see how they try to sort of introduce some kind of element of higher morality or thinking, and how that narrative tends to get crushed under the weight of violence and the nature of the world here. Okay, so that's it for now. I will continue in just a minute.